Does the Australian government and the publicly funded media hate regular Aussie citizens? Based on recent reporting, it's entirely possible. In early August, when pro-Palestinian protesters were blocking traffic and marching over the Sydney Harbour Bridge, the government made their position clear. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, as reported by SBS, called the pro-Palestinian march peaceful. Specifically, he said, "In a democracy, it's a good thing that people peacefully express their views. Yesterday's march was peaceful and an opportunity for people to express their concern about what is happening in Gaza and the images that we've seen." Okay, so obviously he and his government are supportive of people expressing their views in the form of a protest. I mean, that's what we'd expect from our national leaders. Well, fast forward to this month and we have a very different story. Just yesterday, 31st of August, the March for Australia rallies took place in cities across the country, with people protesting against the government's immigration policy. And how did Mr. Albanese and his government respond this time? Did they congratulate the marchers for peacefully expressing their views? Not quite. Instead of calling it peaceful or a democratic expression of views, the government and media, in a chorus of condemnation, criticised the protesters. Prior to the rallies, SBS reported, "Un-Australian, government criticises March for Australia rallies amid community fears," and warned that immigrants could become targets. Yes, the same government that celebrated a protest blocking a major bridge as a peaceful expression of democratic concern is now labelling a different protest as un-Australian. Home Affairs Minister Tony Burke said, "There is no place in our country for people who seek to divide and undermine our social cohesion. We stand with modern Australia against these rallies. Nothing could be less Australian." Nothing could be less Australian than a bunch of Aussies waving Australian flags? I guess not. What about a bridge full of Palestinian supporters? Not just Palestinian supporters, but Iranian supporters as well. Because, as you can see in this photo, protesters were openly carrying portraits of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who has been accused of crimes against humanity. And here's the kicker. Since that protest, the government has found out that the Iranian government was responsible for at least 2 recent attacks on Australian soil. The ABC reported, Australia expels Iranian ambassador after ASIO says it directed anti-Semitic attacks. Not to mention, as reported by SBS, the Australian government is moving to designate Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist organisation. But yet, this protest was praised. You can't make this stuff up. Prior to the March for Australia rallies, the Minister for Multicultural Affairs, Anne Ali, who is an immigrant herself from Egypt, condemned the protests, saying, "This brand of far-right activism grounded in racism and ethnocentrism has no place in modern Australia." She has since said, just today, as reported by SBS, "March for Australia protests clearly racist," Minister says. It's almost as if some protests are more equal than others. Just while we're on this photo, you may recognise Greens Senator Marine Faruqi, an immigrant herself from Pakistan, who also marched under the portrait of the Iranian Grand Ayatollah. With regards to the recent March for Australia protests, she said, "The anti-immigrant rallies on the weekend must be called out for what they are, acts of racist fear-mongering and hate." The media, of course, especially our ABC, were right there backing the government's condemnation of these pro-Australian protests. The ABC reported, "Community leaders say weekend rallies stir memories of white Australia policy. Multicultural Australians have described the fear, hurt and disappointment sparked by the anti-immigration rallies." In the article, they mention the far right no less than 8 times. For example, experts are raising concerns about the strategies far-right groups are using to attract ordinary Australians. Far-right activists are incredibly savvy. Experts warn of far-right tactics, far-right groups that are explicitly anti-government. It is clear certain sentiments of the far right were resonating with parts of the community. The rallies suggest that broader segments of the Australian population are in line with far-right sentiment, far-right thinking, particularly around anti-immigration sentiment. We can do more to ensure that we are resilient to these forms of extremism, hatred, and political movements that can divide us and lead to these sorts of far-right situations. When reporting on the pro-Palestinian Harbour Bridge protests, do you think the ABC ever referred to the protesters as far left, or even just the left? No, not once. Even though most of the protesters are clearly left-wing, aligning with anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism and social justice causes. But back to the far-right article, they refer to non-Caucasian Australians as multicultural Australians, which is a term I don't particularly like, as it seems to separate multicultural Australians from regular Australians, reinforcing an us versus them mentality, rather than promoting a single, cohesive Australian identity. But then we shouldn't expect anything less from our ABC. Of course, they highlighted that some of the rallies were attended by prominent neo-Nazis and showed photos of protesters holding white unity placards and one holding a photo of alleged police shooter and fugitive Desi Freeman. Essentially, the article conflates regular Australian protesters to the sovereign citizen movement and white supremacists. There was certainly no mention of the protests being peaceful or a good example of democracy at work. Interestingly, who else do you think attended last month's pro-Palestine Harbour Bridge march? Convicted terrorists, of course. Actually, the ABC did report on this, so credit where credit is due. Sydney cleric Islamic State child groomer target pro-Palestinian cause for recruits. They wrote, "A man caught on camera flying a black flag on the Sydney Harbour Bridge was a convicted terrorist and youth recruiter for notorious jihadist spiritual leader Wissam Haddad." In the article, they show the picture of convicted terrorist Youssef Youenat waving his flag on the Sydney Harbour Bridge. They show a picture of the notorious jihadist Wissam Haddad. Here's Mr. Youenat unmasked. He had served nearly 4 years in prison for grooming and encouraging Australian minors to launch attacks. So yes, these upstanding citizens were both hanging about at last month's pro-Palestinian protests. But no, what we have to worry about is a few Aussies waving the Australian flag. It's a strange kind of logic, isn't it? One group of protesters shuts down a major city icon and the government pats them on the back for exercising their democratic right, but another group marches with a less government-approved view, not on a bridge but through the streets, and they are vilified as racists and dividers. It makes you wonder, what exactly is the criteria for a good protest? Is it the message, the location, or is it simply whether the government agrees with you?